All right, good afternoon, and welcome to the Summer Symposium sponsored by NEBA and the Arditi Center for Risk Management at DePaul University. My name is Carl Roth, and I am now an emeritus professor since I retired July 1st. This is my last official act, and before I go too far, I'd like to introduce you to my colleague, Vahap Yusal. Oh, there he is. He's taking my place in the Arditi Center. So I know you'll treat Vahap with all the same respect and grace that you've treated me over the years. It's a pleasure to have been associated with NEBA. Now, this conference with the Arditi Center, a little bit about Fred Arditi, who had a very successful career in both industry and academia. He was a colleague here at DePaul and at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. He led the team that developed the Eurodollar futures contract. After Fred passed, the CME generously donated the seed money to establish the Arditi Center for Risk Management. And Fred believed that everything should be done at the highest level to the best of your ability. He especially believed in applied research, rigorous research, but academic research that would address practical real-world problems. Now, the Arditi Center embraces that philosophy, and we pride ourselves on being a forum for the free exchange of ideas in all things risk management. This program today is a good example of that commitment. So we're delighted to collaborate with NEBA on this summer symposium. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, John Roth.
Thanks everybody for coming. I have the pleasure this year of chairing this symposium, which is the 6th in a series. And we're very, very happy to be here. We're sorry to be losing Carl. And unfortunately, I never had a chance to take his class when I was a student here. But I thought it might be instructive if we read the top 3 comments on ratemyprofessor.com for Dr. Luft. I think the first one is probably very true to form. The first student said, Dr. Luft is by far the best professor I've ever had. He gives great career advice, supports the well-being of his students, and if you want to know the foundations of finance, you need to take Professor Luft. It's a pretty glowing review. The second one, the second rated one, said that I took Dr. Luft last year. I'm currently working. Without his class, I would have been lost and jobless. If you want to learn and accomplish something in life, you must take Dr. Luft. Wow. The third comment is he is absolutely the worst professor in the entire world. This is my second master's degree, so needless to say, I've had a lot of professors. I have never wrote a negative comment before on this site in my life, but this guy deserves it. Disjointed, unintelligent, and useless teaching style. I think this might be the president. Oh yes, he is arrogant, and has no merit. Don't take him, don't take him, don't take him. So I guess you can't win them all, Dr. Love. But thank you so much for everything you've done for NEBA. This symposium would not happen without Carl. We're very sorry to lose him. He is a professor emeritus now. That basically means that DePaul wants him to continue teaching occasionally and not pay him nearly as much. So you'll have the opportunity, hopefully, to see Dr. Carl here again, and we certainly hope that we can count on you in the future. Thank you for everything you've done. So a couple of housekeeping notes. We're going to have 3 sessions today, and after each session there's going to be about a 10-minute break. We've got a really packed group of people that are very, very knowledgeable in the industry. It's going to be a terrific symposium. We don't want to hold anybody up, so if you could keep it to 10 minutes in the hallways, that'd be great. And of course, we've got a cocktail reception on the 11th floor immediately following the symposium, which you're all welcome to come to as well. To begin, we're going to continue our series of armchair discussions with the former president and chief operating officer of the National Futures Association, Dan Roth. Dan served as president of the NFA from 2003 to 2017. He joined NFA in its infancy in 1983, rising to be its general counsel and then CEO. His 30-plus years of experience in the NFA covered everything from the introduction of equity index futures, the transition from the floor to the screen, the futurization of swaps, and the collapse of long-term capital management, Lehman, and MF Global, and the chaos that ensued. Reflecting on Dan's leadership and experience will provide valuable insights as to what may come next. Dan earned his Juris Doctorate at Loyola University, and even though we're sitting in the largest private Catholic institution in the world, we'll forgive him for going to Notre Dame for his undergrad. Dan is being interviewed today by Matt Kluchenik. Matt is a partner at Mayor Brown's Banking and Finance Group and a member of the derivatives and fintech practices. He was previously a partner in another law firm that I kept emailing last week by mistake. And he served as an associate general counsel at CME Group. He's also served as an adjunct professor at the Northwestern University Pritzker School of Law, where he teaches a course on derivatives law and practice. So please welcome Dan Roth and Matt Kluchenik.
Thanks, John. Okay, so let's get started here. Dan, thanks for joining us today. You've obviously got tremendous experience. You know, probably know as much about the futures industry as really just about anyone in town, maybe even in the country. But before we talk about, developments, trends, maybe some retrospectives, take us back, way back. Tell us how you got involved in, what was then just really kind of a burgeoning industry.
Yeah, it was a circuitous route. So I had, my original career path was to work in baseball. And I got a job after a lot of effort with a AAA ball club in Des Moines, which was then affiliated with the White Sox. And after about 3 or 4 seasons, we were in the American Association, was the name of the league. And I noticed that not a single person from the American Association had moved from an office job in the AAA to a major league job. So I said, well, this isn't auspicious. So I talked to the White Sox and said, would it be helpful if I got a law degree? And they said, that'd be fabulous. And so I went to law school here in Chicago, and while I was in law school, worked for the White Sox part-time. And during the course of law school, realized that I had no business working in Major League Baseball because I couldn't spot a good ball player to save my life. So I ended up going to Sidley and Austin after law school and didn't like that too much. Went from there to a couple of years trying official misconduct cases at the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. And this was pre-Graylord. Most of these people probably don't remember Graylord, which was a major FBI investigation into corrupt judges. So it was pre-Graylord, which means that I was trying public corruption cases in front of largely corrupt judges, and that wasn't a lot of fun. So after about 2 years, I contacted a buddy of mine at Sidley, I said, geez, I'm thinking of looking around. And they said, well, Jeff Harrison has just left Sidley to be general counsel at a new organization called NFA, and why don't you give him a call? So I did. And I had an interview on a Monday. So over the weekend, I went to the Cook County Law Library and read the Commodity Exchange Act.
Which was probably about what?
Yeah, it didn't take a long
7
time.
pages?
So that when I went in for the interview, I was able to ask him the penetrating question, why aren't onions commodities? And then I ended up spending 34 years there. So it was a circuitous route to get there. But once I got there, it was really fun. It was a really fun job.
So, we all know NFA is an SRO, and we talk about self-regulation. At least from my perspective, self-regulation, sometimes it's in the news for, intense periods of times, and then you just don't hear much about self-regulation. I remember maybe it was going back 15 years or so where there was a lot of noises from the CFTC about maybe self-regulation isn't the right model for futures. Maybe exchanges shouldn't be able to have or own or control their own self-regulatory functions, and maybe NFA should do everything and anything regarding self-regulation. This is a broad question, but talk to us a little bit about, from your perspective, the role of self-regulation and maybe how it's changed over the years.
Well, I'll start with what hasn't changed. To me, there's 2 ways to express, I think, in my view, the real purpose of self-regulation. And which way you choose depends on what audience you're talking to. For general audiences, I think it's safe to say that the purpose of self-regulation is simply to provide effective and efficient regulation for the industry. Really effective regulation that accomplishes the public policy goals that need to be accomplished, but done with a private sector sort of efficiency. The shorter way to express that thought is that the role of self-regulation is to keep the government off the industry's back. And the way you do the second one is by doing the first one. The purpose of self-regulation in one sense is to, it's based on the recognition that if the industry doesn't police itself, the government's going to step in, and whatever the government does, it's going to cost more and be less efficient than private self-regulation. And the fact is there's a sort of a recognition that bad headlines make for bad law, and bad law is bad for business. So the purpose of self-regulation is to prevent bad headlines. And you're never going to prevent all of them. You do the best you can. And the better you do your job, the more we're sort of in the background and not in the news. When we are in the news, that means something's gone wrong.
Do you think maybe that's what led to some extent, regulation, intense regulation via the Dodd-Frank Act of swap dealers? Swap dealers, as we know, certainly had a robust trade association in ISDA, but never really a self-regulatory organization.
Yeah, I think that sort of fit into my view of the world in that they didn't take on a self-regulatory role for that industry. And talk about bad headlines, they don't get much worse. And the bad headlines led to a Congress does what Congress does. I mean, they tend to react to headlines, and sometimes they overreact. And what ends up, what could have been solved with a more efficient approach sometimes gets a more draconian approach. So, yeah, I think that is kind of an example of where some bad headlines led to some bad law, and there was sort of a vacuum there where there was no real self-regulatory function being performed, and the price was paid.
And the two really, go together, right? Because we hear, and we've all heard about the CFTC, perhaps rightly so, going to Capitol Hill and talking about lack of resources. Yeah. We hear that all the time. And I mean, frankly, without the NFA, as active and robust as NFA is, I'm not sure where that would lead the CFTC, but really critical in this industry, would you say?
Well, somewhat biased view, yeah, I think we're pretty critical. It's always interesting that the debate over CFTC resources. I'm always sympathetic that I'm sure they do need more resources. I don't doubt the legitimacy of that argument at all. So I'm just going to offer my own. We didn't talk about this the other day, Matt. So this is just kind of a personal take on government in general. I'm always suspicious of any politician who claims they're going to achieve savings by making government more efficient, because I think an agency like the CFTC, it's designed to prevent the abuse of power rather than to achieve efficiency. And I think that's probably appropriate. But if you take a look at an agency like the CFTC, NFA has one CEO. We got a board and 1,000 people on the board, but we got one CEO. The CFTC has 5 commissioners who are selected basically on their likelihood to disagree. They're from different political parties, so they are chosen based on the likelihood that they'll disagree with each other. And instead of being there for a long time, they tend to rotate pretty quickly. Their term is 5 years, and a lot of them serve less than that. So there's a lot of turnover and a lot of built-in sort of disagreement, all of which fosters checks and balances and prevention of power, none of which fosters efficiency. So, I've always thought that as a self-regulator, the best thing we had going for us was that the bar for regulators is set at such a low level that if you do anything that looks like it makes common sense or anything to try to actually work with the industry, it's startling to people. Self-regulation is always going to inherently be more efficient, I think, than government regulation, because that's just the way government's set up.
Yeah, and just to pick up on something you mentioned, if you could, Dan, talk a little bit about, maybe if you will, the relationship between the NFA and the CFTC. I frankly think that there's a lot of people out there who don't really understand how close they are, or maybe how close they are not.
Yeah, I always thought that one of the most important hires NFA ever made was that when Bob Wilmoth hired Dan Driscoll away from the CFTC to be head of our compliance department. And I think Dan was chief accountant at the CFTC. He was at the Commodity Exchange Authority before he was at the CFTC. And Dan is basically my age, but I always used to kid that he was actually appointed to that position by President Hoover, but that wasn't really true. But he'd been there a long time, and while he was at the CFTC, he was the source. He was the guy that everybody at the commission would go to because he has an encyclopedic knowledge of the regulations and tremendous judgment as to how those regulations are supposed to be applied. So that when he came to the CFTC, to NFA, he was still that go-to guy for the CFTC. So the CFTC was calling NFA to ask for advice and guidance because they had that kind of confidence in Dan. So our relationship with the CFTC, we've always worked very hard at it. We view the role of self-regulation as really being a bridge between the industry and the government. And so I know some of these things sort of evolved over time, but we would meet with each of the commissioners on a quarterly basis, just so they know what's going on at NFA and what issues we're working on and what's coming up at our next board meeting and what to expect. The last thing, we learned this the hard way, you never want to surprise the CFTC with a rule submission. That's a very bad idea. So we always try to make sure they know exactly what's going on at NFA. At the commissioner level, we meet with DSIO on a quarterly basis just to let them know all the rule development issues that we're seeing, that we're working on. And we meet with the Division of Enforcement on a quarterly basis just to tell them, here's all the investigations we've got going on. We're trying to make sure we're not duplicating efforts. So there's all that regular meeting, and then there's a daily, I don't think there's a day that somebody at NFA is not talking to someone at the CFTC about something. So the relationship has been a pretty effective working relationship since day one, largely because of Dan, but I think throughout the years we worked very hard at maintaining a partnership where we are clearly the junior partner. I mean, they oversee us, we don't oversee them, but we try to work very, very closely with them and try never to surprise them, and generally have tried to, like I said, be that bridge. You know, we understand what the CFTC thinks the public policy concerns are and need to be addressed, and we talk to the industry and, you know, say what's the best way to address this. And so you act as a go-between, you act as a liaison, a bridge, and it's painful and frustrating, but usually it works out at the end.
My sense is, despite that sort of parent-child relationship, if you will, the CFTC is, for the most part, most regimes has allowed the NFA to act, you know, independently, without intermeddling too much.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing in dealing with any government agency, in that, you know, the regulatory philosophy of the oversight agency can do a 180 based on after any given election.
Yep.
So they can, you know, sway in the wind quite a bit. And as a self-regulator, what you try to do is you just try to, sometimes you have to tack a little bit one way or tack a little bit the other, but you try to keep a straight line as best you can, keep working toward what you want and what you know is right and the right way to do it. So it poses its challenges because, like I said, you know, there's a new guy starts Monday. Well, the new guy at the CFTC and the new chairman may have very different views of what the old chairman was. Now, they're both Republicans. It's more likely after 2020 you could see a more sort of dramatic change in regulatory philosophy. And you try not to get caught up in a game where we're playing yo-yo, where it's just these wild swings. You try to work with the government regulator and let them know why you're doing what you're doing, and you may have to tack a little bit left or right, but keep going straight as best you can.
And on that point, I mean, I've always viewed one of NFA's missions to be that of education to market participants.
Yeah.
Obviously critical. NFA does, you know, a phenomenal job, but it also seems like at times, right, a fair amount of education to CFTC commissioners.
Oh, sure.
We've had a lot come in with really not that much experience.
And, you know, every time there's a new commissioner, the poor person we send them this briefing book on NFA that could choke a horse. And, you know, sit down with them and try to get them up to speed as quickly as we can about what we do and how we do it and how we work with the CFTC. Some of them come in having worked with us on different aspects and they know us very well. Others, not so much. So, yeah, there's a lot of education that goes on. It generally, and sometimes their staff, you know, the staff is so important. The commissioner's staff, and sometimes they're people that have been at the agency for 10 years and they end up working for a commissioner. Sometimes they just came from outside the industry, or outside the commission, outside the industry, and it's as important to get the staff up to date, up to speed, as it is the commissioner.
Right.
So it's an educational effort on several different fronts, and that's just part of the job.
Yeah. So circling back to self-regulation a little bit, we have heard, I'd say probably over the last year or two, virtual currency market participants express an interest in some sort of the Winklevoss twins and others in creating a self-regulatory organization or effort.
Yeah.
Someone who knows more than a little bit about self-regulation,
Yeah.
what sort of challenges do you see for those folks?
Yeah, it's all, I've been interested in just reading the articles because I think the twins mentioned at one point they wanted a self-regulatory organization patterned after NFA, and then I looked what they created, and I said, well, that's not patterned after NFA. I think there's two major hurdles that they're going to have to overcome if they want to create a self-regulatory body, a meaningful one. First of all, and you see this in Europe some too, where what they call self-regulatory organization. It's not a trade association. It's not someone who just issues best practice guidance. And please be good boys. You've got to have some regulatory authority. You've got to have the authority to take action against people that don't follow the rules. And those actions have to have consequences. And to do that, you need two things. One is you need some scheme of mandatory membership. And that was a major hurdle in the creation of NFA, because when I wasn't there at the time, but I mean back in the late 70s, mid 70s, when they were proposing this scheme of mandatory membership, the Justice Department said, well, I don't think so, that's a violation of the antitrust laws. So Congress in 1978 had to amend the Commodity Exchange Act to say, notwithstanding any other provision of law, meaning the antitrust laws, it's okay for Futures Association to have mandatory membership rules. So I think if you don't have mandatory membership, then the people that most need the regulation are the ones who are not going to be members of the organization. You need to have mandatory membership. The other thing you need, I think, as a self-regulator is some sort of, and it can only be given, I think, it's possible to achieve through common law, I guess, but it helps a lot to have a statutory protection from litigation, so that every time something hits the fan.
So like immunity?
Yeah, and
form of it.
we don't, I mean, FINRA has absolute immunity, I think, from civil litigation. God bless them. NFA has what's Section 22 of the Act, which says that in order to sue a self-regulatory organization like NFA, you have to demonstrate not only that they failed to enforce their rules, but that they did so in bad faith. And that bad faith standard offers some protection. And without that kind of protection, every time some cryptocurrency broker, every time some wallet gets filched, every time there's some sort of massive fraud, people are going to sue the regulator, among others. But the regulator is going to get sued. And if you don't have that sort of statutory protection, the litigation costs and threats are just going to be endless. So I think to create a self-regulatory body for cryptos, I think you're going to need legislative action, because I think you're going to need mandatory membership, and I think you're going to need some sort of insulation from civil litigation. And I don't know how you can achieve either of those likely without some form of legislation.
Yeah, the immunity is certainly a big deal. Bad faith, of course, basically is tantamount to fraud, and to be able to show fraud in that context, extraordinarily difficult. I can't even think of a lawsuit that's gotten past, a dismissal stage against an exchange or NFA. There's a few bills percolating on the Hill that would address cryptocurrencies, virtual currencies, but I don't think any of them really address this idea of self-regulation. And so, I wonder, and this is just a thought, I wonder if whether it's the Winklevoss twins or others are kind of like actively lobbying their legislators to say, hey, we need sort of that baked into this bill if we're going to have a chance to have a...
Well, certainly in the futures world, it was the industry that lobbied for the legislation that led to the creation of NFA. It was the industry that wanted this, and they were able to lobby Congress. So I suspect without the industry pushing for it, it probably won't happen.
Yeah.
Unless there's a bad enough headline. You're always one really bad headline away from Congress jumping in and saying, we're going to do something, we're going to do it quick. So I guess you could get it without the industry pushing for it. But the industry really should push for it. It's in their enlightened self-interest. So it'll be interesting to watch how that develops.
But you think, but in this age, do you think it's really possible? I mean, we hear now from a lot of members on the Hill that, one of the problems with self-regulation is it's too close to the industry. We hear that,
Yeah,
right? We
it's
hear
a
that.
bunch of crap.
And that's perception, right? And so, that's a roadblock that the cryptocurrency folks are
Yeah,
going to
but
have
we've
to.
been answering that for, honest to God, for 40 years.
Right, right.
I just don't buy it. Obviously there's a potential conflict of interest inherent in the self-regulatory process, but that's what government oversight is for. That's why there is a CFTC, to ensure that to guard against that kind of conflict of interest. The other thing is that, using NFA as an example, our board was structured in such a way as to really reduce those conflicts of interest, because it's not like we just had FCMs. We had FCMs and IBs and CPOs and CTAs, and later the swap dealer guys, and all of those groups, at times on certain issues, their interests would be adverse to each other. And so no one segment of the industry dominates the board, and so there's sort of an inherent checks and balances. So between checks and balances and the board structure and government oversight, I think you can deal with that. And the benefit, obviously, of the self-regulation is what we talked about. I mean, it's way more efficient. And the problems get solved in ways that actually work, because you have industry. And you don't just have industry input. We don't just seek industry comment. We have to get industry approval for our rules. So we get rules that work.
Right.
Yeah, so I got tired of that argument a long time ago, but you still hear it. But, I mean, there's a ready response, I think.
Well, we could dispel that notion of coziness real quickly with the poll. I mean, raise your hand if you think NFA is too cozy with you.
Well,
so, done. Friendly, yes. Cozy, of course not. So, when you were in your role, Dan, what would keep you up at night? Would systemic risk or another MF Global? Talk about some things that would just keep you up.
Systemic risk. I mean, it's always got to be at the top of, if your job as a self-regulator is to prevent bad headlines, nothing causes more bad headlines than a systemic risk issue or an FCM blowing up. So it's not strictly just systemic risk. I mean, we could have small FCMs back in the early days, back in the early 80s. We had a couple of FCMs that no one even knows their name anymore, but they would become insolvent when capital levels were really low. And they didn't present a systemic risk issue. But anytime an FCM blows up, it's bad. I don't care how small the FCM is. So systemic risk issues in general, and then the changing nature of the systemic risk issues, because it gets more and more complicated, and you're always worrying about, what's the source of the risk that we haven't addressed? How does cybersecurity affect systemic risk type issues? And as when I started at NFA, there were probably 350 FCMs. As I understand it now, there are fewer. And so you've got more risk concentrated at fewer numbers. And so it's systemic risk is something that always keeps you awake.
Yeah, so at the FCM level, would you say maybe even the clearinghouse level, is that, or no?
Yeah, we don't have any regulatory authority for clearinghouses, thank God. And I mentioned this to you the other day, but one of the commissioners was talking to me one time, and he said, Danny, I'm really concerned about CME clearing. We just don't devote enough resources at the commission to oversee CME clearing, and I don't know what we'd ever do if CME clearing failed. And I told him, I said, we've had a plan at NFA since day one on how to deal with the failure of a major clearinghouse. And he said, oh, God, share this. What's your plan? I said, well, each officer of NFA has been given a cyanide tablet. And if it happens, we all go. It's if I was at the commission, that's what would be keeping me up, I think, would be clearing issues. And not just the systemic risk, but I mean, now we got all the international regulatory issues involving clearing and duplicative regulation. Systemic risk is so important, and clearinghouses are at the heart of it. So if I was at the commission, that would be very high in my
Sure. So, I mean, I think we have a good representation of market participants in the room, IBs, of course, some CTAs, so on and so forth. But just tell us a little bit, when NFA was given authority with respect to swap dealers and that whole, just talk to us a little bit, how difficult was it to sort of get your arms around this huge new industry?
That was pretty fun. because, we'd be sitting here watching the legislation develop, and over time it became increasingly clear that, it looked like the CFTC was going to have a major role to play in the regulation of swap dealers. And it was very clear to us that if the CFTC was going to have a major role, we were going to have a major role, because that's the way it works. The CFTC, frankly, recognizes its position, and I think would prefer to be an oversight regulator rather than a frontline regulator. So, we had some time to think about this because we thought it was likely to play out, to come our way. And our thought process was, we know nothing about swaps, or next to nothing about swaps. But we know the process. We know the self-regulatory process. We know how to get the right people in the room and find common sense solutions to problems. We know how to work with the agency, with the commission. We know how to, deal with a board. We know how to deal with advisory committees and work, like I said, as a bridge between the industry and the commission. So for a while there was a thought that there might be a different SRO that would take this on. But every time we looked at it, without trying to be as objective as we could, we'd say, none of that makes sense. We're the only one that makes sense. So when it started to come our way, we sort of, we had to make, the first hires were really critical ones.
Yeah.
And that we hired a woman to sort of, she was just so smart. We hired a woman to be sort of before we actually got this, she was going to be our consultant to help us begin the exploratory process here. And she was smart as a whip. And she didn't work out one bit because she kind of thought she was a little bit of a big shot. And if you think you're a big shot, you're not going to make it in NFA. So we were saying, okay, let's try this again. And we were lucky enough to find Jamila Parazzi, who knew swaps backwards and forwards, but she was also our kind of person. She had the right skill set. She had the right mentality. She, she wanted to work with the industry. She didn't think she knew everything. She was an NFA person.
Yeah.
So, and then it was a question of getting the right people on, on our advisory committees, on our board, trying to talk to the people and say, who in this industry is smart and reasonable? And you start getting some names, and you start reaching out to people and say, would you help us serve on this committee? And it was fun, because you got to, there's the nuts and bolts of it. Part of it is, how do you fund those operations? How do you set up the governing structure? I mean, you have these swap dealers coming into this organization that's futures dominated. How do you satisfy them through a governing structure that they're not going to get trampled by these futures guys? And we came up with an idea for that, and we pitched it to those guys. And in one meeting, they said, yeah, that'll work. And it was done. We had a funding issue. How I said to the industry, I said, look, here's the only rule. You guys are going to pay. I don't care how you pay, but tell us how you want to pay. You want a transaction fee? Do you want membership dues? How do you want to do it? And they said, yeah, membership dues makes the most sense. Let's have a tiered structure, big guys, little guys. And we got that done in 2 meetings. So some of these issues that looked at, oh my God, we'll never get them, they were done pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And it fell together pretty well. And then it was just a question of staffing up. So it was really fun, just because organizationally, to try to figure out a way.
It's like a big acquisition, right? I mean, in a sense. Yeah.
And and then we'd also remind ourselves, hey, you're not that big. Oh my God, we're going to have as many as 500 employees. So we're still pretty small. But it was fun to try to figure out how to incorporate all this stuff, and trying to figure out all the ways that NFA had to change, but at the same time trying to think about all the ways we had to stay the same. And that attitude, we always tell our people that, as an SRO, you got 2 jobs basically. One is to help members comply. The overwhelming majority of members want to comply, help them comply. And the second job you have is for those few members that don't want to comply, figure out who they are and get rid of them. So it's 2 jobs, and it's the same thing with the swap dealers. So it was fun trying to figure out how to make it work structurally, from a governance point of view, from a financial point of view, from a compliance point of view, from a personnel type thing. It was a real fun
wholesale.
undertaking.
How about culturally? Because when I think of the swaps world, especially pre-Dodd-Frank, right? Swaps folks and futures folks, they worked in different buildings or different floors or different
Yeah.
areas, and they really didn't talk to each other,
Yeah.
right? And just apples and oranges.
Yeah, and that was one of the always one of the interesting things about our board meetings was that was one time where every aspect of the industry was in the same room together. And integrating swap dealers into that was kind of interesting because, like you said, they were the new kids, and it's like when your first day of school, and you have to come in and find your spot, your desk, and they were the only guy. The rest of the school had already been there, and these guys were coming in and feeling like the outsiders. And but again, the governance structure, I think, helped address that. Getting the right people with the right attitude to sort of serve on the board and the committees was a big part of it. And then there was just an educational process for both sides, for the swap guys to figure out what the futures guys are about, and the futures guys to figure out what the swap guys are about. So it was just really interesting to sit back and watch it all. It was kind of fun.
Yeah. Okay, before we get some questions, which I'm eager to get, I want to put you on the spot just a little bit. So when we talk about regulation, it's a pendulum, right? We've seen it swing back and forth, back and forth. We had the CFMA, right? The no regulation over swaps. We've had principles versus prescriptive regulation. Any thoughts about what's ahead in terms of regulation? You think it's going to tighten up? You think it's going to loosen up? Any thoughts?
Well, I think that's going to be determined by two different things. One is the next election. That's going to have a big impact. And the second is bad headlines.
So I'm really asking you for an election outcome.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
But if you can prevent something really bad from happening, if you avoid the regulatory blow-up, then you're just dealing with what's a big deal. I mean, it's the election, and you get a new set of a new chairman who may have a different regulatory philosophy. So I think the flow of the pendulum will be controlled by those two things largely. And again, the pendulum can swing for the CFTC and for Congress back and forth, and the goal as a self-regulator is let the pendulum swing, and you just keep going straight ahead
Stable,
as best you
yeah.
can. You're going to be affected some degree, one way or the other, but try to just keep doing what you think makes sense.
Absolutely. Okay, any questions or comments? Let's start. Brad, go ahead.
Yeah, Brad Rosen from Walters Clerk. You touched on it very briefly, but can you speak a little bit about the whole notion of parallel proceedings, the self-regulators
Yeah.
and the CFTC,
Yeah.
both bringing actions,
Yeah.
also known as double teaming,
Yeah.
piling on?
Yeah, we hate that.
Some other people might have some descriptors as well.
We hate that. We've always, the reason we started meeting with the CFTC Division of Enforcement was to avoid duplication of effort. And it's a real pain in the neck for us if, when the government duplicates a regulatory action that's already been taken by the SRO, that's not good for anybody. It's not good for the SRO. It's not good for the industry. I don't think it's a very efficient use of CFTC resources. If the CFTC thinks that an SRO didn't achieve the right result or had imposed a sanction that was too lenient, the CFTC has the authority to take review of that case. That's the process that's supposed to be in place. Yeah, it's a pain. That's a bad thing.
Can we write an op-ed on that piece? Because so we don't see that with NFA, but we see it all the time with the exchanges.
Yeah.
And it's it's a piggyback formula at times, it seems.
Well, again, now this is just me offering a personal opinion. It's not NFA speaking at all. But, when you watch congressional hearings, which you should avoid if you can, but when you do have to watch one, the enforcement results become sort of politicized in the sense that they always want to trump that we had more enforcement actions than we had the previous year. We had a couple years where our enforcement actions were going down, and we told Bob Womath, he said, this is a good thing. It means the level of compliance is higher. This is good. And we said, look, it tracks customer complaints. Customer complaints are down too. But I think the CFTC, Congress never wants to hear that. Congress just wants to hear that enforcement actions are up. And so that puts a lot of political pressure on the commission, I think, to do stuff. Now, I've never asked someone at the CFTC if they give into that kind of authority. We were supposed to repeat that question. I just saw John getting the microphone. And now people are going to be listening to this tape for 10 minutes not knowing what we're talking about. But the question involved duplication of enforcement actions by the CFTC over an SRO. I understand where they face political pressures to build stats, and we always felt like we're insulated from that kind of pressure. For us, enforcement actions are never about building stats. We don't, and I feel bad when I see that kind of duplication happening.
Ansley, I think you had a question?
I think you focus a lot on Dodd-Frank as a big turning point in the last 20 years. But have there been any other initiatives, CFTC or NFA level initiatives, that have really made a big difference with respect to industry compliance or maybe enforcement actions?
Well, John, do we have to repeat that, or did that microphone pick that up? Yeah. So the question was, besides Dodd-Frank, whether there are other initiatives that we think have had a significant impact from a compliance point of view. And I think Peregrine and MF Global. And I think the daily confirmation of seg balances at an FCM was a huge step forward that was precipitated by FCM failures. And but I think that was a huge step. So that was, again, it wasn't a CFTC, it wasn't Congress doing something. That was the industry responding. And again, the way that came about was, it was a bad thing, it was a bad time, and we sat in a room with a bunch of SROs and a bunch of board members and said, let's put our heads together, figure out a solution, and we, within a couple of meetings, come in and put, daily confirmation of seg balances, and I think we were able to implement it within a couple of months. So I think that comes to mind as being a major initiative that I think has had a big impact.
Other questions, comments?
Dan, was it Dan?
Again, right around the time of Dodd-Frank, there was a lot of problems in the energy industry with FERC standing forward and some disjointed margin rules with the Forex. And I thought the FERC kind of challenged the notion that's been very important to the industry that the CFTC has exclusive jurisdiction over futures. And do you think that has been resolved in the last couple of years, or is there's still confusion there?
Yeah, I think, I suppose there's still confusion because the law, I'm sorry. Again, the question that Dan asked was whether or not the granting of authority to FERC to bring enforcement cases regarding manipulation of energy products, whether that's created confusion. Was that a fair assessment of the question? And I think the answer is yeah. I don't think there's been a whole bunch of cases that FERC has brought. So I think it's a problem that's sort of latent. But there's going to be a time when you've got two different agencies with two different sets of rules trying to define what constitutes manipulation of an energy derivatives market. So it hasn't been a problem in the sense that we've had a proliferation of cases, but it's a problem that's lurking there and it's going to jump up and bite us at some point. And I think it was again, I think that's another situation where bad headlines lead to bad law, and the creation of that kind of confusion by clouding the CFTC's exclusive jurisdiction. So I think.
We're just talking to somebody like Philip Johnson many years ago about what allowed the futures industry to take off back when it did, and it was a work that exclusive jurisdiction was kind of the key to the growth that we saw. Yeah. So I think it's not a good thing whenever you have sort of overlapping jurisdictions between government agencies. That's not generally a healthy situation.
Just going to say, it was exclusive until Congress said it wasn't, right? And gave FERC authority. Fortunately, via MOUs and other stuff, those agencies worked it out. But look where we are right now with cryptocurrencies. Yeah. And how many regulators, and SEC is focusing on manipulation, the CFTC, FinCEN, not manipulation, but other stuff. So,
I've always said that if there was an 11th commandment that thou shalt not covet another's turf, every regulator on earth would go to hell. And they may be going there anyways, but So, you see it with the energy, you're going to see it with cryptos. It just surfaces from time to time.
Yes.
So Dan, technology advances, every 2 years. There's something new out there. We see a lot of the books and records going out to the cloud now.
Yeah.
And you see the risk out in the cloud. We had outages 2 weeks ago. Everything was down.
Yeah.
What are your concerns as far as, regulations are always lagging.
Yeah.
This stuff is moving at quantum speeds.
Yeah.
What are your biggest concerns around, this embracing of technology risk and not understanding it?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sorry to repeat the question. It was given the leaps and bounds technology makes, and especially in the area specifically of retention of books and records, what kind of regulatory problems does that pose for a regulator? I always told people that I always felt it wasn't so much that the regulators should keep up with the industry, because I think that's impossible, but it's important to keep their tail lights in view. And I think in the technology realm, that sometimes those tail lights get a little too far ahead of us. So yeah, I think that's a source for concern, and I think it's something that the regulators are focusing on. I know NFA spends a lot of time dealing with technology issues. One of the things that helps us is that we're out in the field and talking to members, and confronting the issues firsthand and kind of being educated by the members in the front lines, and then you try to assess, how do we have to change our regulatory approach with respect to those changes. But it's not easy, and it's the kind of thing that the way life works sometimes is that it's not until something bad happens that people's energies all get focused in the same direction. So I think the question you asked is sort of one specific manifestation of how technology keeps changing for the industry, and every time technology changes for the industry, it poses a new regulatory challenge for the regulators. And keeping up with that is hard. NFA's, one of the biggest changes that happened at NFA while I was there, especially in the last 5-7 years, was the growth of our IT department. My God, I think it's maybe it's almost as large as the compliance department now. The number of people we have working on cybersecurity from where it was 5 years ago. So we devote more and more resources to that, but we're going to have to. It's not going to change. It's not going to end. And every time you go to the board and you say we need more resources in the technology area, well, nobody on the board is going to say you do not. So it's an ongoing challenge that everybody recognizes, and you just have to keep devoting resources to it and hope that you avert disaster. Averting disaster is always very high on any regulator's list, but it's a challenge.
Anyone else? All right, Dan, thanks so much. Thanks for your great service
It was great
to
fun.
the industry. Thank you.
Thanks so much.